Hello, in this video and for the next few, we'll be talking about generative patches on the Matriarch. I've had a lot of requests about that over the past few months, so I guess I'll try to take it on. There's a lot to cover, so I'm going to split this up into a bunch of videos and again make a series of videos about generative patching. More on that later. Don't know if there's a true definition of generative. There probably is, but for our purposes, we'll think of a generative patch as a patch with a system of user-created rules which allows music to be randomly generated and evolve over time. So, of course, in the strictest sense, a generative patch would require no help or manipulation from the musician or user or whatever you want to call yourself. Some people think listening to a machine create music isn't real music, but I'm not really going to get into that now. Well, you know what? Actually, maybe I should talk about that briefly. So before I go on a monologue here, in this video I'll show you how to put together two very simple generative patches and talk about what I think are the important elements of a generative patch. In the videos in the coming weeks, we'll get more into generative patching, talk about the limitations and advantages of using a Matriarch for generative patching, and of course, build more complex patches. Anyway, there's an index and links in the description if you want to skip around. Okay, a strict generative patch, in other words one with no real-time manipulation from the musician, can be a composition in its own right, or a great way to come up with new musical ideas for another composition. Maybe you find a short section or tone or, well, anything and build from there. It can be an excellent exercise to get to know your setup and learn more about synthesis. Random generated music, I guess depending on how random you get, can at times be a little bit hard to listen to. In my experience, it's usually more fun for the performer than for the listener. And I've heard arguments that generative music is not real music, as mentioned. It's just a machine creating random sounds. But that's what the rules I mentioned are for. You can decide to go fully random, create a strictly generative patch, or keep some common elements of traditional music in there to rein in the weirdness if you want. The point of the rules is that you are in charge of what is created, and your own personal musical choices are responsible for the end result of the music. So as you experiment with more and more generative music, you'll see just how many musical decisions have to be made, and it could be argued that although the patch itself is generating a melody or a beat or whatever, you are the one responsible for composing it because it was your choices that led to its creation. Anyway, I guess we can leave the musical philosophy for another time. This is a real complex topic, and there's a lot of ways you could go about doing this. So this series may be a little chaotic. I'll do my best to organize it as best as I can. At first, I thought we should look at the elements of a synth, or modules, first, which of course are essential in constructing those rules that I talked about before. But there's already a bunch of great videos out there that use that approach with generative patching. So I think I'm going to come at it from a different angle and put this series together in a more exploratory way. So instead of looking at this from the standpoint of gear, I'll look at it from a musical point of view and start with four basic elements of music: time or rhythm, harmony and melody, timbre and tone, and expression. And I'll build patches with each of those elements as the focus and see where that leads us. So in most cases, because we'll be focusing on one musical element at a time, we won't be developing fully generative patches in the strictest sense until we're at the end of the series of videos, which at the moment I think will be at least 4 or 5. So in this video, I'm going to start with the last element I mentioned, expression. And probably the most basic form of musical expression would be dynamics, which just as it happens allows us to deal with one of the most fundamental and important parts of a synth, a VCA. So let's get to it and start patching. Okay, let's start with a quick review of how the CV inputs on the VCAs on the Matriarch work. So first, let's just switch the VCA mode to drone, which is just an open VCA, and I'll bring up an oscillator in the mixer. And I'll patch the triangle LFO into the CV input for VCA1, and we can see what happens. So it's obviously modulating the volume and both left and right channels. And as you can hear, if I patch into the CV input for channel 2, I'm just modulating the right side. So just like on the filter and the delay, the left and right sides of the CV inputs are normal. So if you want to modulate both with one CV source, plug into the left side. If you want independent, plug into the right and left. Okay, just about done my tuning here. So I've got the 4 oscillators tuned to a major ninth. Well, I guess it's not really a major ninth because I don't have a 7th. I've got to add 9, I guess. So I've got the oscillator 1 playing the root, oscillator 2 the 3rd, oscillator 3 the 5th, and 4 the 9th. And as you can hear, all the oscillators are set to triangle waves, and I like that sound, so I think that's where we're going to start. As mentioned before, this patch will not be generative in the strictest sense. The plan is to take a look at the individual elements of a generative patch, this time specifically expression. So the goal with this patch is to create generative or evolving dynamics. I guess the type of patch we associate with evolving dynamics the most is a drone, so let's build some drones. Not the shooting kind, though. Alright, so let's modulate VCA channel 1 with a sine wave from our mod bay. And open the VCA. Cool. Okay, and I'll just mess around with the different LFO speeds until I find something I like. Sounds good to me. We got 2 independent LFOs modulating a stereo VCA. Easy peasy. I'm not sure if this is technically generative, and I don't know if I really care, but even though it may take a while to recognize it, there will be a pattern in the modulation because both LFOs at the moment are static. So let's change that. So I guess the easiest way to do this would be to use one LFO to modulate the rate of the other. So I'll molt the sine LFO and patch it into the rate input of the triangle LFO and keep it modulating the channel 1. And you know what? I'm going to molt the triangle LFO as well. Why not? And let's see what happens if we use the triangle LFO to then modulate the rate of the sine LFO. So out of the molt into rate input. And it looks like we're going to have to wait. They both must be on the low end of their cycle. There we go. It's a little chaotic, so let's attenuate some of the modulation. We'll just patch this into an attenuator and job done. And you know what? I think I'm going to do it with the other LFO as well. So we're attenuating the amount of rate modulation of each LFO. Cool. So there's still going to be a pattern in our modulation, but it's going to be a much more complicated pattern because now we've set up a much more complicated set of rules to govern our modulation. So there's a real simple generative dynamic drone, or some icing on the cake, could add some long reverb. Cool. Again, easy peasy but effective patch, especially with the added reverb. But we're really only modulating a stereo VCA, nothing that special. We don't have control over the volume of the individual voices. Okay, so let's start from scratch and give that a try. So the first thing I'm going to do is loop the envelope, so patch envelope out to trigger input. This essentially turns each envelope into a unipolar LFO. If we keep the VCA in split mode, the 2 envelope generators are internally routed to modulate each VCA independently, so we don't need to patch anything. The speed of the LFOs created by our envelope generators is dependent on the attack and release times. The sustain and decay really won't have any effect. I should have set up the scope for this so we could see the LFO shape, but if you have a listen, it's pretty obvious what it's doing. It's basically a triangle LFO, but the attack and release will change the shape of the triangle. If we set the release to 0, we'd get a ramp, and conversely, if we had attack at 0, we'd get a saw. But the longer the attack release, the longer it takes for the envelope to complete its cycle, and the slower the LFO is. And for this patch, I definitely want some nice slow LFOs fading in left and right at different rates. Cool. That sounds pretty good, but I'm going to unpatch that for a second. And what I want this patch to do is automatically change the volume of each of the different oscillators. I could, of course, do that manually, but we're trying to make a generative patch where this happens automatically. But it is fun to just play with these knobs. Going into saturation, get some pretty neat sounds. Okay, but the problem is on the Matriarch there's only 2 VCAs and we've got 4 oscillators. But the good news is we do have 3 voltage controlled attenuators, so we can use those as VCAs. So what I'm going to do is patch the wave outs of oscillators 2 and 3 into attenuators 1 and 2, and I'll patch wave out of oscillator 4 into attenuator 3. And I'm going to patch out of the attenuators back into the mixer on the Matriarch. So attenuator 1, which is oscillator 2, into the oscillator 2 input on the mixer. And I'll do the same thing with the other 2 attenuators, patch them into the mixer. Okay, great. Now let's put the Matriarch in drone mode. And I'll just turn everything down in the mixer first, bring up oscillator 2. And you can see if we put the attenuator at 0, make sure we do this with all of them. There we go. We're getting a little bit of leakage, if you can call it that. And oscillator 1 is still just going to be controlled by the mixer for now. Okay, so now we've got to set up our modulation for each of our attenuators. So I'm just going to use the triangle LFO for attenuator 1, patching it into the CV control input. And there we go. And I'll get those envelope generators looping again, so envelope out to trigger input. Again, bipolar LFOs. And I'm going to use these to modulate the other 2 attenuators, so out of the envelopes into the other 2 attenuator CV inputs. And these are bipolar, so we don't have to worry about them going in the negative range. And we can still use the mix to control the overall volume of each voice. Oh, and it's important that we're in drone mode now, not in split VCA mode. Otherwise, the envelope generators would be modulating both of our VCAs as well. So keep it in drone mode for this. Okay, that sounds good with just the 2 oscillators, but let's get our third oscillator, oscillator 4, in the mix as well. I like the sound of the saturated triangle, so I'm going to keep the mixer pretty high for this, up around maybe even over 12 o'clock. Oh yeah, that sounds good. Let's try a little bit more saturation. Get some more harmonics in there and bring in oscillator 1. Yeah, that sounds great. Okay, I like how this patch is coming together already. Really like the independent swelling voices, but let's get some more modulation happening. I'm going to take the wave out of our mod bus and put it into the mult, because we're probably going to need a lot of copies of this. I've got the LFO set to random slewed wave. And let's go out of the mult into the rate input of our triangle LFO. The slewed random wave on the Matriarch is very gentle, so it's really great for subtle modulation like this. You know what, I'm going to demonstrate that actually. So I'm going to turn down the other oscillators in the mixer first. And so we really can hear this clearly. I'm going to remove the triangle LFO from the CV control and use the random wave. If we crank up the rate, you can really hear it, but you see that it's really a gentle modulation. So let's put that back into the mult and put the triangle wave back in there. And we'll keep the slewed wave modulating the rate of that LFO. Great, sounding good. Let's add some of the secret sauce, the good old Matriarch delay. That thickens it up nice. And I'm going to put it right on the verge of self-oscillation. So put the feedback up pretty high. There's oscillating. it sounds so good. This delay is so great. You know what? I really love the sound of that delay just as it slipped into self-oscillation for a second. So I think what we should do is modulate the delay. So I'm going to use the filter envelope generator. So I'm just going to patch in a tip-top mult cable, putting it back into the attenuator so it's still controlling our volume, but we'll go out of the envelope into the feedback CV input for the delay. Whoa! I think we're going to have to attenuate that a little bit. But before I do that, let's try modulating the time. Cool. Also a little bit over the top. So I'm going to grab a Splix, a passive attenuator. I use these in tons of patches. And I'll patch that into the time. And just attenuate it and dial in. And oh, that sounded cool. Oh, that's really cool. Just attenuate that a bit. Just want a little bit of modulation. And let's modulate that feedback. And I'll patch from the mult, which is our slew random, into the feedback, which we've already mentioned is fairly gentle modulation. That's sounding pretty good, but I'm going to turn up the feedback just a tiny bit so it's just on the point, so the modulation brings it over occasionally. Nice. Okay, that does it for our second generative VCA patch. Since I have the oscillators tuned in harmony, we can change the chord or key with a single key press. Obviously, pitch and timbre are not generative in this patch. We'll talk about generative pitch and timbre in another video. So for now, I'll just manually modulate the filter and play the keyboard. And of course, no ambient patch is really complete without reverb, although this one almost doesn't need it. The delay on the Matriarch's doing a great job, but let's add in some reverb anyway. I'll use that Universal Audio Lexicon plugin again. Okay, you know what? I just said I wasn't going to talk about generative pitch, but this patch is really sounding pretty great, so I might as well show you a little trick I like for pseudo-random pitch generation. I'm going to go into global settings and set the ARP sequence clock input to step advance, which means the clock only advances when it receives a high gate signal. That's a D#2, C#0, and D0. With nothing patched into the clock input, the Matriarch will still use its internal clock, as you can see. So what I'm going to do is patch out of the square utility LFO into the clock input on the back of the Matriarch. And that's made a big difference. But let's just make a few adjustments. Play with the time of the LFO. it's still a bit too fast, so slow it down and change the range to 1 octave so it's not as much movement. Bring that feedback back again. Cool, that's sounding good. And now we've got a generative patch. Okay, that does it for the first video on generative patching with the Matriarch. In the next video, I'll continue with expression and show you a couple more patches that focus on envelopes and articulation, and we'll do a couple more things with our VCAs. Then in future videos, we'll take a look at the other 3 musical elements I mentioned in the beginning of the video, harmony, rhythm, and timbre. But for now, I'll just let this patch run for a minute or 2, and you can enjoy it and have a listen. Thanks for watching.